The snow came down in a hush, blanketing the world in a cold, quiet judgment. Every flake that settled on the sagging roof of the cabin felt like another nail in the coffin. The wind howled through the pines, a low, hungry sound that promised a long, bitter night. Inside, the only light came from the dying embers in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. On the floor, a woman named Ruth Ann lay on a rough plank floor, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her face was a canvas of ugly bruises, purple and black like a thunderhead. A thin, torn quilt did little to stop the shivers that racked her frail body, worn down by a cruelty that was sharper than any hunger. Beside her, two small boys knelt. Twins. Jonas and Jesse, their faces identical masks of terror. They clung to her hands, as if their small touch could somehow anchor her soul to this world. Jonas, older by only a few minutes, had his jaw set like a grown man, but his eyes were wide with a child's fear. Jesse, the quieter of the two, had his cheek pressed against his mother's arm. He was whispering to her, tiny words meant only for her ears, pleas that the silent, creaking walls of the cabin seemed to absorb. Outside, the snow tapped against the single grime-caked window. Tap, 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 like someone was trying to get in. But the boys didn't hear it. Their entire world was shrinking, disappearing with every weak beat of their mother's heart. Life had whittled Ruth Ann down to almost nothing. Years ago, she'd had a light in her eyes, but small-town gossip has a way of snuffing out that kind of light. They never forgave her for having two sons at once. The townsfolk treated the twins like a bad omen, a curse upon the land. Her mother-in-law, Martha Glay, was the worst of them. She called Ruth Ann weak, useless, a fragile thing not meant for the hard ranch life. Her father-in-law, Ezekiel, was a man carved from cold stone. He never raised a hand to defend her. His silence was a permission slip for Martha's bitterness, and that bitterness spread like a sickness. It came in whispers, then in shoves, then in the bruises Ruth Ann learned to hide under long sleeves. To live in that house was to try to become invisible, but kids see everything. Jonas and Jesse watched their mother fade away, day by day, until only this faint, flickering spark was left. Jonas's voice finally cut through the heavy silence. "We can't stay here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She's gonna die if we do." His small hands trembled as he pushed a stray lock of hair from his mother's swollen face. "We have to find him." Jesse's eyes shot open wide. He knew exactly who his brother meant. They'd both heard the stories, the whispers from other children in town. Tales of a giant who lived deep in the mountains. A man with a beard like a thorny thicket and arms as thick as tree trunks. Some folks said he was a killer. Others swore he'd lost his own family to a brutal winter years ago and had his heart frozen solid. His name was Thaddeus Boone, and just saying it felt like a dare. Ruth Ann had never ever spoken his name, but the boys had wondered. In the dark, lonely nights, they'd wondered about the monster in the mountains, and now that monster was their only hope. You think he'd help us?" Jesse asked, his voice barely a wisp of sound. Jonas swallowed the lump in his throat. His gaze was fixed on the cabin door, on the swirling snow outside. "He has to," Jonas said, his voice harder now. "There ain't no one else." The moment they pulled the heavy door open, the storm hit them like a physical blow. The wind clawed at their thin coats and the snow bit at their cheeks. They left their mother lying in the faint orange glow of the fire, a tiny island of warmth in a sea of cold. The wilderness welcomed them with a deep, humming silence that was more terrifying than any scream. Their boots sank deep into the snow, and their breath plumed in front of them like tiny ghosts escaping into the night. They held hands, two impossibly small figures against a vast, uncaring landscape. Behind them, the faint light in the cabin window flickered, threatening to go out at any second. They didn't look back. They couldn't. They just walked, pushing forward into the heart of the storm, toward the monster on the mountain. High above, in a clearing surrounded by snow-laden pines, Thaddeus Boone swung his axe. The sharp crack of steel splitting wood was the only sound, a lonely heartbeat in a frozen world. He was a man made of silence, built for solitude. His shoulders were wide enough to carry logs that would take two lesser men to move. Frost clung to his thick beard, and his wild hair fell to his shoulders. The years alone had carved harsh lines into his face, but they hadn't carved away everything. He'd lived a long time without hearing a single laugh, a long time with only the howl of wolves to remind him that other voices existed. His cabin was small, but sturdy, its chimney puffing a steady stream of smoke into the starless sky. He was in the middle of a powerful downswing when he saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the tree line. He froze, the axe burying itself deep into the chopping block. He just stared. Two children. It couldn't be. Two little boys, barely dressed for a cool evening, let alone a blizzard. Their cheeks were raw with cold, and their eyes were wide with something that went far beyond fear. It was pure, uncut desperation. Jonah stumbled forward, his little legs shaking. "Mister," he gasped, his words torn away by the wind. "Our mama. She's dying." Thaddeus didn't move. He just blinked, the snow collecting on his eyelashes. For years, he had turned his back on the world. He'd let its problems, its cruelties, its heartaches pass him by. It wasn't his business, none of it. But the sight of these two boys, their hope so frostbitten and fragile, holding their mother's life in their trembling hands, it struck something deep inside him. Something he thought had died and turned to stone long ago. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He strode forward, his massive boots crunching in the snow. In one smooth motion, he scooped Jesse up into one arm and Jonas into the other. They were no heavier than kindling. He turned, his long legs eating up the ground, breaking a path through the deep drifts, heading toward the faint, flickering light he could just barely see in the valley below. This wasn't his business. But now, it was. The cabin door moaned in protest as Thaddeus pushed it open, his massive frame completely filling the doorway. The stale air hit him first, the smell of sickness, of poverty, and something else. The faint, coppery tang of blood. Ruth Ann was sprawled on the floor, barely conscious. Her eyes fluttered open at the sudden rush of cold air, and she saw him. This giant of a man, silhouetted against the raging storm. A flicker of pure shame crossed her face. Even now, on the edge of death, she was worried about what this stranger, this monster from the mountains, would think of her. Thaddeus moved with a strange grace for a man his size. He knelt beside her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He gently pressed two thick fingers to her wrist. He could feel it. A pulse so faint, so thready, it felt like a trapped bird beating its wings against his skin. It was so weak, he felt like a single gust of wind could scatter it for good. For just a second, the giant closed his eyes. A flicker of something crossed his face. It wasn't pity. It was something else. A memory, maybe. Or an old, familiar grief that suddenly recognized itself in her. He knew this kind of pain. Then, his eyes opened. Without a word, he slid his powerful arms beneath her broken body. She weighed nothing. But the weight of her suffering, the years of it, pressed down on his chest with the force of a mountain. The boys, their eyes wide and silent, followed him as he carried their mother out into the raging storm. The snow clawed at them, but Thaddeus moved like he was part of the storm itself. Every step was certain, every breath was measured. He didn't falter. He carried her up the mountain, back to his own cabin, the place he had guarded from the world for so long. His cabin door swung open, and a wave of warmth rushed out to meet them. He laid Ruth Ann down on his own bed, a simple cot covered in thick furs. He was so gentle, it seemed impossible for a man with hands that big, hands that were calloused and scarred from years of hard labor. The boys huddled together in a corner, watching this wild man they'd heard so many terrifying stories about. They watched him move with a tenderness they had never ever seen from their own family. He boiled water over the fire. He took down old glass jars filled with dried herbs, crushing them in a small stone bowl. He soaked a clean cloth and began to carefully, methodically, clean the wounds on her face. Ruth Ann stirred. She moaned softly and tried to turn away, a lifetime of shame making her want to hide her face. But Thaddeus just hushed her, not with words, but with the steady, patient pressure of his hand on her shoulder. Her eyelids fluttered. Through the haze of fever and pain, she saw fragments of his face. The wild, tangled beard, the fierce, dark eyes that were now softened by the firelight. A question tried to form on her lips, but it was lost in a weak sigh. The boys crept a little closer. Jesse, clutching his brother's sleeve, finally found his voice. Is she going to die?" he whispered. Thaddeus didn't answer. He didn't look at them. He just wrung out the cloth, folded it neatly, and laid it across her feverish brow. He turned and added another thick log to the fire. The flames roared to life, and the shadows in the small cabin leaped and danced. For the first time in what felt like forever, the room was filled with warmth and light. He pulled a small stool to the bedside and sat down, his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the fragile rise and fall of her chest. Outside, the storm threw itself against the cabin walls, but inside, a heavy, strangely intimate silence had fallen. Hours crawled by. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Ruth Ann's shallow breathing. Slowly, so slowly, a little bit of color started to return to her cheeks. Her lips parted, and she whispered something, a single word too soft to hear. Thaddeus leaned in closer, the smell of pine and cold snow still clinging to his clothes. Her eyes opened, just a slit. Her pupils were wide, swimming in the fog of fever. She stared at him, and her expression was a strange mix of terror and something else he couldn't quite name. It looked almost like recognition. Why? Her voice was a raw, broken rasp. Why would a man like you help a woman like me? The question hung in the air between them, as fragile as a pane of ice. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Thaddeus stared into the flames, his face unreadable. He didn't answer her. He just shifted his weight, reached for another log, and placed it carefully onto the fire. The room filled with even more light, wrapping all of them in a blanket of warmth. In the corner, Jonas and Jesse, finally overcome by exhaustion, had curled up together on a bearskin rug and fallen asleep. Ruth Ann's gaze lingered on the giant beside her, searching his silence for an answer he wouldn't give. And maybe the silence was the answer. That sometimes, the greatest kindness doesn't come with words or explanations. It comes in the quiet, stubborn refusal to let another soul be swallowed by the darkness. Her eyes closed again. But this time, it wasn't the surrender of defeat. It was the beginning of a fragile, flickering return. The storm howled, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. An unspoken promise had been born in the heart of the fire. But that wasn't the whole story. Not even close. Because as Thaddeus stared at the woman in his bed, he knew this was no random act of kindness. He knew exactly who she was, and he knew the wolves who had done this to her. He had been waiting for them for a very, very long time. For the first time in 20 years, Thaddeus Boone woke to the sound of someone else's breathing. The silence he had cultivated for so long was gone, replaced by the soft sighs of a healing woman and the restless stirring of 2 little boys. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through the frosted window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room felt different. It felt alive. Thaddeus sat by the fire, the steady scrape of steel on stone filling the morning quiet as he sharpened his axe. But his eyes kept drifting to the bed. Ruth Ann's color was better. The dangerous fever had broken in the night. Every time he drew the blade across the whetstone, it felt like a silent vow. She would not fall. Not on his watch. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. Thaddeus cooked, simple meals of venison stew and beans, and the rich smell drew Jesse out of his shell. The boy would watch the giant with wide, hungry eyes, slowly inching closer to the fire. Ruth Ann, still weak but fiercely determined, insisted on mending one of Thaddeus's torn shirts. Her hands trembled, but the stitches were small and neat. There were no grand speeches of gratitude, no apologies for shattering his solitude. There were only these small, quiet acts. Mending a shirt, sharing a meal. Each one was like a thread, slowly weaving the four of them together into a strange, unexpected tapestry. A family. One afternoon, the boys laughed. A real, genuine laugh, the first in months. Thaddeus had lifted them both up, one on each of his massive shoulders, and their happy shrieks echoed off the wooden rafters like a song he had long forgotten how to sing. But for every moment of warmth inside the cabin, a cold shadow was growing outside. The world hadn't forgotten them. And in a small town, whispers travel faster than a blizzard. When the storm finally broke, Ruth Ann was strong enough to walk. She needed supplies, things for the boys. Leaning on Thaddeus for support, they made the trip into town. It was a mistake. The whispers followed them down the muddy main street like a swarm of angry bees. Women stopped sweeping their porches to stare, their faces pinched with disapproval. They leaned together, their voices sharp and cruel. Living with that wild man, they hissed. No shame. Men gathered outside the general store, their eyes hard. They muttered about what kind of mother would abandon her kin to shack up with a mountain hermit. A recluse who, they reminded each other, probably had blood on his hands. The news reached Martha and Ezekiel Glay like a lit torch to dry tinder. They exploded with righteous fury. Their words painted Ruth Ann as a wicked, ungrateful harlot, hiding her sins behind the shadow of a giant. This was their chance to finally be rid of her, and to take the boys they'd always seen as their property. It wasn't long before Sheriff Abram Coyle made the trip up the mountain. His boots crunched on the fresh snow, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet clearing. He was a man caught in the middle, torn between the letter of the law and the powerful will of the Glay family. His eyes flickered from Ruth Ann to the two boys, who were now clinging to her skirt. He cleared his throat, his discomfort obvious. "Thaddeus," he started, not quite meeting the big man's eyes. "Folks are talking. Martha and Ezekiel. They want her back. Says you're keeping her here against her will." Thaddeus stood in his doorway, silent. He seemed to grow even larger, towering over the lawman until the sheriff's words just dried up. The firelight behind him carved his face into a mask of hard, unyielding lines. His silence was more powerful than any threat. Ruth Ann trembled, the old shame washing over her in a hot wave. But she didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood her ground. Finally, Thaddeus spoke. Just 2 words. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "She stays." That was all, but it was enough. Sheriff Coyle's eyes widened slightly. He saw something in the giant's face, a line that would not be crossed. He tipped his hat, a gesture of reluctant respect, and turned to leave. But his parting glance was a clear warning. This was far from over. That night, the mood in the cabin was heavy. The boys were asleep by the fire, their faces peaceful in the warm glow. Ruth Ann sat across from Thaddeus, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "I was never wanted," she whispered, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear. "Not by them. From the day Jacob brought me home, I was just a burden, a mistake they had to put up with. I don't know how to be anything else." Thaddeus let the silence stretch for a long moment. He watched her, this woman who had been beaten down until she thought she was worthless. He leaned forward, catching her gaze and holding it. His voice was rough, but his words were not. You were always more than they were man enough to see. The simple truth of it hit her like a physical blow. She looked down, unable to hold his gaze, but her lips parted slightly, as if to savor the words, to hold them close like a precious, fragile treasure. For the first time, someone had seen her. Not the burden, not the mistake, but her. But the peace didn't last. The tension outside the cabin grew thicker with each passing day. Ruth Ann grew stronger, and the boys' laughter became more frequent. But the storm gathering in the town below had nothing to do with snow. It was a storm of hate. Martha and Ezekiel returned. They didn't come to the door this time. They stood at the edge of the clearing, their figures dark against the white snow. And they screamed. They screamed accusations of sin, of filth, of a mother who had abandoned her sacred duty. "You'll rot in hell for what you've done!" Martha shrieked, her voice a poison dart slicing through the cold, clean air. "Bringing shame on my son's name!" Thaddeus appeared in the doorway, as immovable as the mountain behind him. Ruth Ann flinched back into the shadows of the cabin, the old fear pinning her like a knife. The boys ran to her, their small hands grabbing her dress. The in-laws demanded she come back. They demanded the children. They demanded Thaddeus release what was theirs. But the mountain man didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent, unbreachable wall. His very presence was an answer. His silence infuriated them more than any argument could have. They finally left, spitting curses into the snow, but not before Ezekiel leveled a bony finger at the cabin. "This ain't over, witch," he snarled. "We'll be back, and we'll burn you out." Inside, Ruth Ann finally broke. Sobs tore through her as she covered her face with her hands. "They'll never stop!" she cried. "They'll never let me be. And they'll destroy you because of me." Thaddeus didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat by the fire and picked up his sharpening stone and his axe. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was steady, deliberate. It was the sound of patience, and it was the sound of a warning. She watched him through her tears, and in his quiet, resolute strength, she found a sliver of courage. The twins, half asleep on the rug, stirred. "Please, Mama," Jesse mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Don't go back. Don't leave us." Those words burned away her despair. They lodged in her heart like a hot coal, glowing with a fierce, protective fire. No, she would not go back. She would not let them have her sons. But there was another secret hanging in the air. A question Ruth Ann was too afraid to ask, and a truth Thaddeus wasn't yet ready to reveal. He hadn't just saved a random stranger. He had seen her locket, a small silver oval she kept tucked inside her dress. He had seen it the first night. And he recognized the faded engraving on the back. It was an engraving he had carved himself, more than 20 years ago, for a woman named Eleonora, Ruth Ann's mother. The night of the final battle came with a fresh storm, the snow slashing sideways, driven by a furious wind. It was a whiteout, the world swallowed by a swirling fury. But through the blizzard, points of light appeared, torches, a mob of them. Martha and Ezekiel were at the front, their faces twisted with hate in the flickering orange light. Behind them were a dozen men from the town, their courage bolstered by whiskey and Ezekiel's promises of reward. "Burn the monster out!" someone yelled. "Get the witch!" The wolves in the distance began to howl, their voices rising and falling with the wind, as if the wilderness itself was screaming a warning. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, oblivious to the hatred gathering outside. Ruth Ann stood by the window, her whole body trembling, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Thaddeus rose to his full height. He moved to the door, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence in that doorway was a declaration of war. But the turning point of the night didn't belong to the giant. It belonged to the small, broken woman he had saved. As Thaddeus reached for the heavy iron bar to bolt the door, Ruth Ann put a hand on his arm. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She stepped past him. She pulled the door open and walked out into the storm. She stood on the small porch, the wind tearing at her hair, and faced the mob. She stood at Thaddeus's side, her knees knocking together, her body weak, but her spirit burning like a forge. Her voice, when it came, was cracked with cold and fear, but it carried over the howl of the wind. "I am not your property," she yelled, her words aimed at Martha and Ezekiel. "I am no one's burden. My sons and I, we belong where we are shown kindness. You will not take that from us." Her voice rang with a raw power that stunned the mob into silence. They stared at this woman, this ghost they had beaten into submission for years, now standing before them, unbroken. They had never seen this fire in her eyes. Martha's face contorted with pure rage. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. But behind them, some of the other men started to shift uncomfortably. They looked at each other, the whiskey courage beginning to fail them. Shame, cold and sharp as the wind, began to creep in. No one dared to make a move. Not against the giant who stood like a stone sentinel, and not against the woman who had finally found her voice. But Ezekiel Glay was not a man to be denied. "She's bewitched," he roared, pointing a trembling finger. "The monster has her under his spell. Take them." A man at the front, emboldened, raised a rock. He drew his arm back to throw it, to be the one who cast the first stone. And that's when Thaddeus moved. He stepped forward, putting himself in front of Ruth Ann. But he wasn't holding his axe. He was holding a piece of paper, an old yellowed letter. "Before you do that, Ezekiel," Thaddeus said, his voice booming over the storm, "maybe you should tell these good people about your brother, Jacob's father, the man who owned this land before you." Ezekiel froze, the color draining from his face. I don't have a brother," he stammered. "Oh, you did," Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "My father. You remember him, don't you? The older brother you were so jealous of. The one who disappeared in a hunting accident all those years ago." The mob went completely silent. Every eye was now on Ezekiel. "This," Thaddeus said, holding up the letter for all to see, "is a letter from your own wife, written to my mother after you thought you'd gotten away with it. A confession, detailing how you murdered your own brother, my father, to steal his land, his name, everything." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Martha let out a strangled sob and collapsed into the snow. Thaddeus wasn't finished. He took a step closer, his eyes burning into Ezekiel's. "And your son Jacob? He found this letter a few months ago. He came to me. He was horrified. He was going to expose you, and then he had an accident of his own, didn't he, Ezekiel?" The implication hung in the frozen air, colder than any snowflake. Ezekiel hadn't just murdered his brother. He had killed his own son to keep his secret buried. The man who had been holding the rock let it fall from his numb fingers. The mob was no longer a mob. They were witnesses, and their fury had a new target. They turned, as one, to look at the trembling, horrified man in their midst. Sheriff Coyle, who had been hanging back, finally pushed his way through the crowd. His face was pale, but his eyes were resolute. He knew what he had to do. He pulled out a pair of iron handcuffs. The torches hissed as they were dropped, one by one, into the snow. The fire of the mob was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard justice. Martha's wails were swallowed by the wind as the men she had brought to do her bidding now seized her husband. The storm seemed to die down, its fury spent. The crowd dispersed, taking the disgraced Glaze with them, leaving only silence and the gently falling snow. Ruth Ann finally fell to her knees, a shuddering breath escaping her lips. The boys rushed to her, wrapping their arms around her neck. Thaddeus stood over them, a silent guardian, his chest heaving. His eyes weren't on the retreating townsfolk, but on the fragile, fierce woman who had faced down her demons and won. Dawn broke, pale and golden, over a world washed clean. The storm was over. The wolves were silent. The cabin stood, solid and safe, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney into the crisp morning air. Ruth Ann stepped outside, her sons at her side. They tilted their faces up to the sun, feeling its weak warmth on their skin. Thaddeus joined them, his massive frame casting a long, protective shadow over the fresh snow. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the crushing weight of solitude. For the first time in hers, she didn't feel the cold chains of shame. They stood together, a man, a woman, and two boys, bound not by law or vows, but by survival, by truth, and by a quiet, unspoken love that had been forged in the heart of a storm. The snow buries many things, old secrets, old pains, but it can never bury the strength of a human heart determined to rise. If you were moved by this story of survival and justice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales that remind us of the light that can be found in even the darkest of nights.